She had built her image with precision. Every speech, every photo, every tear was meticulously timed and framed. From the glossy cover shoots to the gravity of royal interviews, Meghan Markle had carefully constructed a public identity that danced delicately between victimhood and empowerment. She was, to her followers, a beacon of courage, an outsider who broke into the fortress of monarchy and dared to walk away when it didn't fit her values. But to her critics, she was something else entirely: a performer, a strategist, a master manipulator. Until now, those whispers lived mostly in corners of Twitter threads and anonymous palace sources. That was until a woman with no crown, no acting career, and no royal blood stepped up and said, without saying any names, that the Empress may be wearing borrowed robes. Jamie Kern Lima had never needed a palace to define her power. She didn't marry into wealth, wasn't born into it, and didn't pretend to inherit it. She earned it. Every penny, every headline, every ounce of influence she wielded was rooted in a real story of struggle, one that included waiting tables at Denny's, being rejected over and over by investors who told her she didn't look the part, and eventually building one of the biggest beauty empires in the world from the ground up. Her journey, unlike the rehearsed rags-to-riches tales we're often sold, was real. And when she spoke recently on a podcast about what separates authentic women from pretenders, it was as if the earth shifted. She didn't name names. She didn't have to. Listeners, critics, fans, everyone knew exactly who she was talking about. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Some women pretend so long they forget they're pretending. They wear crowns, not to serve, but to shield. They project suffering as strength, but they're just hiding manipulation behind a mask of empowerment. That single quote, barely 2 sentences long, was enough to ignite a media wildfire. The clip went viral within hours, clipped and reposted across every corner of the internet. Hashtags began to trend. Think pieces were drafted before the episode even ended. Influencers, former Meghan supporters, even quiet royal watchers began murmuring one shared sentiment. Jamie was talking about Meghan Markle. And Meghan? According to insider reports, she was livid. It wasn't just the implication that stung. Meghan had grown used to criticism, especially from the British press. What cut deeper was who the comment had come from. Jamie Kern Lima wasn't a gossip columnist. She wasn't a disgruntled ex-palace aide or tabloid pundit. She was a celebrated self-made billionaire, a woman's woman, a New York Times best-selling author, and one of the most respected figures in entrepreneurship and personal development today. She was everything Meghan had positioned herself to be. And yet, in just a few measured words, Jamie had called that image into question without even mentioning her name. Behind the scenes, sources claim Meghan scrambled to do damage control. Phone calls were allegedly made. PR teams were briefed. Her inner circle debated whether she should respond directly. But what could she say? Denying it would only confirm suspicion. Acknowledging it would open a door she might not be able to close. And so, she said nothing, publicly. But privately, according to one insider close to her California circle, Meghan was seething. She feels betrayed, the source said. Jamie was someone she admired. Someone she thought was part of the sisterhood. Now she feels mocked, dismissed, publicly humiliated. But was it really personal? Or was Jamie just speaking a truth too many are too afraid to say? This story isn't about a feud between two famous women. It's about identity. It's about what happens when the stories we sell about ourselves begin to crack. And someone with nothing to gain holds up a mirror. Meghan Markle and Jamie Kern Lima represent two radically different paths to power. One built on marrying into centuries-old tradition and reshaping it with modern media mastery. The other built on sweat, grit, and radical transparency. The irony? Both women preach empowerment. Both claim to want to uplift and inspire. But only one walked through fire without needing the flashbulbs to prove she survived. As the fallout from Jamie's podcast episode continues to ripple through social media, talk shows, and tabloid headlines, one question dominates the conversation. Is Meghan Markle who she says she is, or who we were told to believe? And more than that, what does it say about our culture that we're still so easily fooled by appearances cloaked in royalty and filtered through Netflix? This expose will take you deep into that question. Over the next several chapters, we'll explore who Jamie Kern Lima really is and why her voice holds unexpected power in this cultural moment. How Meghan Markle's public image was crafted, marketed, and sold to the world. The cracks in her narrative, from former royal aides to failed podcast ventures. The reaction from Prince Harry, the royals, and Hollywood elites as the confrontation explodes. And perhaps most importantly, how one woman's candid words might just have punctured one of the most carefully guarded public personas of the 21st century. You'll hear leaked quotes, conflicting testimonies, and behind-the-scenes stories that have never been fully unpacked before. You'll feel the tension, not just between Meghan and Jamie, but between the truth and the illusion, between the image and the person behind it. And by the end of this journey, you may find yourself asking a much deeper question. In a world obsessed with authenticity, why are so many of us still buying the performance? So buckle up. The curtain is about to be pulled back, not by a bitter ex-palace insider or a tabloid looking to stir the pot, but by a woman who built an empire on being exactly who she claimed to be. And for Meghan Markle, that might be the most dangerous critic of all. Before she ever brushed shoulders with the most powerful business leaders on the planet, before her name graced Forbes lists and her products dominated the shelves of Ulta and Sephora, Jamie Kern Lima was just a waitress at Denny's. Not a metaphorical one, a real one. She wore the apron, poured coffee at 2 a.m., and smiled through exhaustion because she knew, somehow, deep down, that her story wasn't going to end where it began. For years, she lived a life most would describe as ordinary. But the way Jamie tells it, there was always something extraordinary simmering under the surface. And that belief, that there's more inside you than the world sees, is what eventually set her on a path that would collide, intentionally or not, with Meghan Markle's. Jamie was born to humble beginnings. No silver spoons, no fancy boarding schools, no family name to lean on. Her parents divorced when she was young, and she quickly learned to fend for herself. She worked through college, juggling jobs while studying journalism at Washington State University. It wasn't glamorous. There were no red carpets, no handlers, no paparazzi waiting outside class. Her first big break? A spot on a reality TV show called Big Brother in its earliest iteration. And even then, she wasn't handed fame. She was scrutinized, dismissed, and forgotten when the season ended. But she didn't crumble. She didn't pivot into scandal or sell her story to the tabloids. She went back to work. Jamie became a news anchor and reporter. She was good at it. Natural, engaging, passionate. But there was a problem. Every time she sat under those harsh studio lights, her makeup would betray her. Jamie had rosacea, a chronic skin condition that made her complexion uneven and often inflamed. And the foundation she was required to wear on camera would crack, slide, or simply highlight what she tried to conceal. At first, it was just frustrating. But over time, it became humiliating. Directors would pull her aside. Producers would critique her look. Not her reporting, not her delivery, her face. That moment, for many women, might have signaled the end. An obstacle too great. A system too powerful. But for Jamie, it was the beginning. She began researching skincare and makeup in her spare time, obsessed with finding a solution that worked not just for models with flawless skin, but for real women with real skin conditions. In her living room, she started mixing formulas. She spent hours learning about ingredients, testing textures, watching tutorials on product formulation. Her husband, Paolo, believed in her even when investors didn't. And when they finally launched IT Cosmetics in 2008, they didn't have celebrity endorsements or slick marketing campaigns. What they had was something even more powerful: authenticity. Jamie used her own face to sell the product. No retouching. No makeup artist hiding in the wings. Just her rosacea, and her belief that women deserve products made for them, not just sold to them. And when the brand landed a coveted segment on QVC, she didn't hire a professional model to demonstrate the concealer. She went live on national television, wiped her makeup off in front of millions of viewers, and applied the product to her bare skin. It was a moment that would change everything. That one unscripted act of vulnerability, of daring to show the truth when most hide it, resonated with women everywhere. Orders exploded. IT Cosmetics sold out in minutes. And Jamie became more than a CEO, she became a movement. Over the next few years, IT Cosmetics grew into a juggernaut. From QVC to Ulta, from local shelves to global expansion, the brand became synonymous with inclusion, honesty, and purpose. In 2016, she sold the company to L'Oreal for $1.2 billion, becoming the first female CEO in L'Oreal's 100-year history. And even after the sale, Jamie remained at the helm, steering the brand with the same raw, grounded energy that built it from scratch. But success didn't make her quiet. If anything, it gave her a microphone. Jamie began speaking out about rejection, about sexism, about body image and beauty standards. She told the truth about investors laughing her out of rooms, about being told women wouldn't buy products from someone who looked like her, about crying in the shower and going back to work anyway. When she published her best-selling book, Believe It, she didn't sugarcoat a thing. She talked about anxiety, insecurity, imposter syndrome, and the lies women are sold about what it takes to succeed. She urged her readers to chase purpose, not perfection. And her message struck a nerve because it wasn't polished. It was personal. This is where the contrast between Jamie Kern Lima and Meghan Markle begins to take shape, not as a feud, but as a philosophical divide. Meghan, too, has spoken of rejection, of identity struggles, of feeling unseen or unheard. But where Jamie's stories feel raw and unvarnished, Meghan's often come wrapped in layers of PR sheen, carefully choreographed interviews, and strategically placed pauses. Jamie cried on QVC in front of millions to make a point about real beauty. Meghan cried on Oprah in front of millions to highlight pain that some claim was dramatized, edited, or self-serving. Whether that's true or not is up for debate, but the perception matters. And that perception is what makes Jamie's recent comments so explosively resonant. When Jamie spoke of women who pretend so long they forget they're pretending, it hit like a thunderclap because she had nothing to gain from saying it. She wasn't chasing headlines. She wasn't promoting a new product. She was simply speaking her truth, one forged in rejection, not privilege. And that's why it felt like a direct hit to Meghan's carefully constructed narrative. Jamie's rise wasn't built on association, marriage, or monarchy. It was built on sweat, suffering, and a refusal to sell out her story. And that makes her one of the few public voices who can challenge a figure like Meghan Markle and be believed. In a media landscape saturated with influencer dishonesty, photoshopped vulnerability, and Instagram-filtered trauma, Jamie Kern Lima stands apart. She isn't trying to be the voice of a generation. She's just trying to be honest. And in doing so, she's become something rare, dangerous. Because when someone like Jamie speaks, people listen. Not because they're told to, but because they know they're not being sold a lie. And so, when that podcast aired, and Jamie's words went viral, something shifted. It wasn't a scandal. It was a revelation. A reminder that authenticity doesn't need a crown. That real power doesn't come from being admired, but from being believed. And for Meghan Markle, whose image is so deeply tied to the idea of being seen, being questioned by someone like Jamie Kern Lima might be the most threatening thing of all. The stage is now set. The crown has been tilted, and the world is watching, closer than ever. It began like any other empowering conversation. A podcast hosted by a woman's network, dedicated to highlighting resilience, authenticity, and the real stories behind success. The episode wasn't meant to be controversial. It wasn't marketed with clickbait titles or controversial teasers. Jamie Kern Lima had simply agreed to appear on the show to talk about self-worth, her journey in the business world, and the lessons she had learned through rejection, failure, and eventually, success. But as the episode progressed, and Jamie opened up in her signature vulnerable yet direct tone, there came a moment not marked by volume or dramatics, but by unmistakable weight. A pause, a slight shift in cadence, and then a quote that stopped everything. "The world is full of pretenders," Jamie said softly, but firmly. "You can feel it. There's a difference between women who've walked through fire and carry their scars with pride, and those who've wrapped themselves in someone else's crown, hoping no one notices the emptiness underneath." No name, no accusation, but everyone heard it. Everyone knew. The podcast host stayed silent for a moment. She blinked, visibly taken aback, before moving on. But that silence, that beat of hesitation, was all it took for listeners to start speculating. Because when a woman like Jamie, who had always focused on building women up rather than calling them out, makes a statement that piercing, it doesn't go unnoticed. Within hours of the episode dropping, it was trending. Clips of the moment were uploaded to TikTok with captions like, "Jamie Kern Lima just ended Meghan Markle's career without even saying her name." Twitter exploded. Instagram was flooded with commentary. Some users expressed outrage. How dare she tear down another woman? Others were relieved. Finally, someone said it. And then came the speculation, the breakdown videos, the commentary podcasts, the media headlines asking the same loaded question. Was Jamie talking about Meghan Markle? For many listeners, the answer was obvious. The crown. The performance. The notion of pretending until you believe your own narrative. It wasn't the first time someone had subtly or directly accused Meghan of constructing a persona, of performing victimhood, rehearsing vulnerability, or using her platform as a smokescreen. But it was the first time such a sentiment came from someone like Jamie. Someone who had built her credibility not through glitz or controversy, but through quiet, relentless authenticity. It wasn't just that Jamie had implied Meghan was a pretender, it was that she had done it without fanfare, without monetizing the moment, without naming names. The absence of drama made it more powerful. This wasn't a celebrity feud. This was a cultural gut punch. And the timing? Couldn't have been worse for Meghan. Just weeks earlier, news had broken that Spotify was canceling its partnership with the Sussexes. The Archetypes podcast had failed to meet expectations, both creatively and commercially. Critics claimed the show lacked depth and felt overproduced, more of a branding exercise than a heartfelt exploration. Listeners began drawing parallels. Jamie was on a podcast dropping hard truths that resonated. Meghan had been on one months earlier, delivering curated narratives that, in retrospect, felt sterile. To make matters worse, Meghan had recently attended a high-profile women's summit in Beverly Hills, where she gave a keynote speech on self-empowerment. Dressed immaculately, she spoke about the importance of being seen, of owning one's truth, and of breaking free from oppressive systems. But for many viewers, the speech felt hollow. Something didn't quite land. The words were powerful, but the delivery lacked vulnerability. It felt, in the words of one viral tweet, like an actress auditioning for the role of herself. So when Jamie's podcast episode aired, it hit at just the right time, or the worst time, depending on which side you were on. Meghan's critics seized the moment. They flooded comment sections, shared Jamie's quote endlessly, and used it to bolster claims that had simmered for years. Claims that Meghan was a master manipulator, that she leveraged pain for profit, that her truth was more curated than confessed. They pointed to inconsistencies, to staff allegations, to body language analyses, to every moment that could be interpreted as performative. But it wasn't just the critics who took notice. Even Meghan's longtime supporters began to waver. Some defended her, of course, pointing out that women are often attacked more harshly for the same strategic behavior that's praised in men. But others couldn't help but feel uncomfortable. Was it possible they had been sold a story? Had they fallen in love with an image rather than a person? The Meghan Markle brand had been built on relatability, on shared struggle, on the idea that she was just like us, a woman of color, an outsider, trying to find her place in a rigid, elitist world. But if Jamie Kern Lima was now implying that Meghan was inauthentic, that she wore a mask of empowerment to hide a core of performance, what did that say about everyone who had believed in her? Inside Meghan's camp, reports suggest panic. Unnamed sources from Montecito claimed that Meghan was stunned by the reaction, that she hadn't expected Jamie's comments, vague as they were, to spark such a wildfire. Some claimed Meghan had privately messaged Jamie, asking if the comments were about her. Others said she consulted her PR team to craft a potential response, though no public statement was ever made. In many ways, that silence spoke louder than any denial could, because Meghan has always been strategic. She knows when to engage and when to ignore. But ignoring Jamie's comment didn't make it go away. It made it grow, because in the absence of clarification, speculation takes root. And in this case, it flourished. Even major media outlets began weighing in. Vanity Fair ran a piece titled, "When Queens Collide: The Meghan Markle-Jamie Kern Lima Divide." The Guardian explored the deeper implications of women critiquing each other in public forums. And The Atlantic published a think piece dissecting why Jamie's comment had such a strong cultural resonance, pointing to a collective exhaustion with inauthenticity in public figures. And through it all, Jamie remained calm, unshaken. She didn't issue clarifications. She didn't backtrack. She didn't stir the pot further. She let her words speak for themselves, which, again, made the moment even more powerful. Because this wasn't about clout. Jamie didn't need it. She wasn't selling a tell-all. She wasn't auditioning for sympathy. She was simply done pretending. And in that moment, on that podcast, she dared to say what many had only whispered. Not all empowerment is created equal. Not all pain is pure. And not every crown is earned. To understand why Jamie Kern Lima's words reverberated so deeply and why they appeared to strike such a nerve, it's necessary to step back and examine the machine behind Meghan Markle's image. Because, for all her modern media appeal and claims of transparency, Meghan's persona wasn't born in a vacuum. It was constructed, deliberately, methodically, and at times, even brilliantly. When Meghan Markle first entered the global spotlight, it wasn't as an actress, it was as a royal girlfriend. Suits may have given her name recognition, but it was her relationship with Prince Harry that launched her into global consciousness. And from the very beginning, the narrative was shaped with careful precision. An American outsider, biracial, divorced, and self-made, stepping into the heart of one of the most conservative institutions on earth. It was the ultimate fairy tale meets modernity plot. She wasn't just a woman in love, she was a symbol of progress, of change, of rebellion against outdated tradition. But with that symbolism came power. And power, as history shows, is almost never left to chance. From the moment her engagement was announced, Meghan's appearances, words, and associations began aligning with a very specific type of branding. She was photographed visiting schools and charities. She launched projects that focused on women's empowerment. She gave speeches on compassion, equality, and inclusion. Her wardrobe shifted. Gone were the form-fitting red carpet dresses of her Hollywood days, replaced by tailored neutrals, minimal jewelry, and what many dubbed the Duchess effect. Every piece worn sparked headlines. Every appearance was dissected. Every statement made was measured. And yet, there was always a sense that something was being held back. That for all the polished speeches and poised interviews, the Meghan the world was seeing wasn't the whole Meghan. She was polished, immaculate, even, but not always relatable. Her story was inspiring, yes, but at times, almost too perfectly curated. It's not to say Meghan's experiences weren't valid. The British press was relentless. The scrutiny was intense. Racism was undeniably part of the equation. But where some saw bravery in her openness, others saw strategy. Carefully timed interviews. Selective disclosures. Emotional narratives released in moments that aligned with bigger career moves. When the infamous Oprah interview aired in 2021, it was pitched as a moment of catharsis, a chance for Meghan and Harry to finally tell their truth. And while the interview did generate worldwide sympathy, particularly around Meghan's revelations of suicidal ideation and the racial innuendo allegedly spoken by a royal family member, critics couldn't ignore the timing. The couple had just signed major media deals. Their Archwell Foundation was gaining traction, and the narrative they presented was one in which they were the misunderstood heroes in a palace filled with villains. The drama was real, but so was the benefit. In the weeks and months that followed, cracks began to form in the narrative. Former palace aides began speaking out, claiming Meghan had been demanding and even bullying behind closed doors. Multiple staffers reportedly quit under her leadership. Some claimed she had weaponized empathy, demanding loyalty while keeping others at a distance. Aides described emotional manipulation and mercurial behavior. And though many of these reports were anonymous and hotly denied by Meghan's representatives, the volume of stories made it difficult to dismiss outright. But perhaps the most telling sign that Meghan's image was more calculated than candid came in the digital content she produced herself. Her Spotify podcast, Archetypes, which was heralded as a groundbreaking exploration into the labels that hold women back, drew mixed reviews. While some praised the choice of guests and her polished delivery, others noted that it felt overly rehearsed, less a conversation, and more a branding exercise. Critics highlighted how Meghan often turned the focus back on herself, even when interviewing women with harrowing or profound life stories. One reviewer from The Atlantic noted, "It's not that Meghan lacks intelligence or empathy. It's that the podcast never feels like it's about the guest. It's always orbiting back to Meghan's own narrative. It's as if she's still trying to convince us of something." And maybe she was. Because here's the truth that many in media know but rarely say aloud. In today's digital world, controlling your story isn't just smart, it's necessary. Especially for women. Especially for women of color. Especially for public figures who are routinely attacked, misrepresented, or misunderstood. Meghan, more than most, understood the power of narrative, and she wielded it masterfully. The problem was that, over time, the distance between the story she told and the public perception of who she really was began to widen. Even her relationships with other celebrities appeared to follow a pattern of careful alignment. Oprah, Serena Williams, Tyler Perry, Ellen DeGeneres, Michelle Obama. Each association added another layer to her credibility. These were women with real influence. Women who had endured criticism and risen above it. By aligning herself with them, Meghan bolstered her own image. She became part of a club, a collective of powerful, enlightened women rewriting the rules. But over time, as some of those relationships seemed to fade or cool off in public, speculation grew. Was Meghan being embraced or merely tolerated? And that's why Jamie Kern Lima's podcast moment hit so hard. Jamie wasn't part of that inner circle. She hadn't vacationed at Oprah's. She wasn't a guest at Montecito dinners. She had no incentive to take a shot at Meghan or to defend her, which meant her words carried a weight that no tabloid smear campaign ever could. When Jamie spoke of pretenders and crowns, she was speaking from a place of earned credibility. She had nothing to prove and everything to lose. But she said it anyway. And in doing so, she shined a light on something millions had quietly suspected for years. That Meghan's empowerment journey, though inspiring in many ways, had become entangled with performance. That perhaps, beneath the branding and the controlled interviews, there was a woman not entirely comfortable with being seen, only with being admired. It's an uncomfortable realization, because we want our heroines to be real. We want to believe that the woman who stood in front of Oprah, eyes filled with tears, speaking of isolation and racism, was baring her soul, not playing a part. We want to believe that her advocacy for women and girls comes from a place of deep personal experience, not strategic positioning. But belief requires consistency. And when Meghan's words and actions begin to diverge, belief begins to fracture. This isn't to say Meghan is insincere. Few public figures operate in a vacuum of total honesty. But what Jamie Kern Lima's subtle indictment forced into the spotlight is this. There's a difference between being strategic and being authentic. And the public is getting better at spotting the difference. We are living in a time when authenticity isn't just appreciated, it's expected. Audiences are weary. They're savvy. They've been sold too many stories, seen too many rebrands, watched too many raw documentaries that were clearly edited within an inch of their souls. And when a woman like Jamie, who once sobbed on live television while showing the world her bare, rosacea-marked skin, talks about masks and crowns and pretend empowerment, people listen. And they compare. And Meghan, for all her media training and brand savvy, may find herself on the wrong side of that comparison. When Meghan Markle stepped into the royal spotlight, she wasn't just entering a family. She was entering an institution, one defined by centuries of tradition, secrecy, and spectacle. And as history has repeatedly shown, that institution does not welcome change easily. For the public, Meghan was a breath of fresh air. Biracial, American, outspoken, educated, and glamorous. She represented the kind of modernity that many believed the royal family desperately needed. But inside the palace walls, her arrival sent ripples through an ancient system calibrated to resist disruption. It is within this tension that Meghan's true brand was born, not merely as a duchess or a newly minted royal figure, but as a modern icon navigating an antiquated machine. Her journey from Hollywood actress to Duchess of Sussex was marked by a series of transitions that would slowly but effectively forge a narrative that extended far beyond royal duties. It was here, during her time within the palace, that the building blocks of the Meghan Markle brand truly began to crystallize. From day one, Meghan understood the power of optics. Long before she became a duchess, She had a curated Instagram presence, a fashion-forward blog called The Tig, and a clear understanding of how to engage with a digital audience. She knew her angles, her lighting, her hashtags. But what worked on the red carpet or social media did not translate neatly into the royal world. Here, the spotlight wasn't just about visibility. It was about accountability to tradition, to hierarchy, and to a family business steeped in historical protocols. Still, Meghan leaned into her strengths. She brought charisma, stage presence, and a camera-ready elegance that instantly elevated public appearances. She was hailed as the new Diana by some, not just because of her charm, but because of her perceived vulnerability and outsider status. The press loved her at first. So did the public. Her wedding to Prince Harry was a global event, viewed by hundreds of millions around the world. Her dress, her speech, her gestures, they were studied, celebrated, and analyzed endlessly. Meghan had arrived. But within the palace, the glow dimmed quickly. According to multiple reports, some from palace aides, others from royal correspondents, the friction began almost immediately. Meghan's expectations clashed with royal tradition. She asked too many questions. She wanted to modernize things. She questioned protocols, challenged hierarchy, and brought with her a distinctly American mindset of meritocracy and self-expression. The palace, for its part, was unprepared for someone so assertive. They were used to deference, not disruption. It wasn't long before the headlines turned. Stories of diva-like behavior began to surface. Aides were reportedly reduced to tears. Staff turnover in Meghan's circle became a point of concern. Leaked emails and insider testimony painted a picture of a duchess who demanded excellence, but sometimes at the expense of empathy. Her supporters called it sexism and racism, an unfair targeting of a woman of color in a predominantly white institution. Her critics saw it as proof of a manipulative, controlling personality that couldn't adjust to rules she didn't write. But while those internal battles raged, Meghan was also doing something else, something far more calculated. She was crafting a persona that extended beyond royal life. Every speech, every charity visit, every photograph was dual-purposed. Yes, it fulfilled royal duty, but it also built her story. A story of a woman who gave up everything for love. A woman who tried to serve, but was met with resistance. A woman who, despite the jewels and titles, felt trapped and silenced. This narrative, however simplified, became the cornerstone of the Meghan brand. It was a story perfectly engineered for the age of social media, relatable, emotional, and divisive enough to spark global conversation. Internally, palace officials reportedly became alarmed at how often Meghan's team operated like a Hollywood PR firm rather than a royal office. Press releases were carefully worded to center her image. Speeches subtly framed her as the protagonist in a personal journey rather than a supporting player in a national institution. And when Harry and Meghan launched their own Instagram account, distinct from Kensington Palace, the shift in tone was undeniable. The posts were glossy, modern, and brand-like. Carefully filtered images, inspirational captions, hashtags, the kind of digital aesthetic typically reserved for influencers, not duchesses. And yet, it worked. Meghan's popularity in certain circles soared. In the US, particularly among progressives and younger audiences, she became a symbol of defiance, of modern femininity, of liberation from archaic systems. In Meghan, many saw a woman standing up to a world that wanted to control her. And she leaned into that perception, gracefully but strategically. She gave speeches about female empowerment, mental health, and racial justice. She shared personal anecdotes that humanized her, even when they raised eyebrows inside the palace. She launched projects like the Together cookbook with survivors of the Grenfell Tower fire, which subtly reinforced her humanitarian brand while connecting her to marginalized communities. Every move was purposeful, and yet, every move also widened the gap between her and the institution she had married into. When Meghan and Harry announced in early 2020 that they would be stepping back as senior members of the royal family, it wasn't just a shock, it was a climax. The brand Meghan had built could no longer be confined by royal duty. She needed freedom, independence, creative control, and so Megxit was born. But here's what many didn't realize at the time. Megxit wasn't an escape, it was an evolution. Almost immediately after stepping back from royal duties, Meghan and Harry launched Archewell, signed major deals with Netflix and Spotify, and began crafting a content empire centered around their story. The Oprah interview, released in 2021, was just the beginning. It was less of a confession and more of a rebrand. Meghan spoke of feeling suicidal, of being silenced, of being told her son wouldn't be given a title. These revelations shocked the world, but they also cemented her narrative as the royal outsider turned self-made truth-teller. The docuseries that followed only deepened the brand. Glossy home videos, curated montages, and sit-down interviews showed a couple supposedly recovering from trauma while simultaneously building a media empire. They were producing their own mythos in real time. And Meghan, once a royal appendage, became the face of that mythos. Strong, wounded, elegant, and above all, centered. But myths are fragile things. And the more polished the image, the more any crack becomes glaring. As time passed, and the promised Spotify content failed to deliver, and Netflix projects faced delays, and the Archewell Foundation struggled to maintain momentum, a question began to form in the public consciousness. What is real and what is performance? This is the question that Jamie Kern Lima's comment reignited. A comment that, while brief, pointed a spotlight directly at the foundation of Meghan's brand and asked, is it solid, or is it just good storytelling? Because if Meghan's empowerment narrative is built on half-truths or exaggerations, if her carefully curated image is more branding than bravery, then what does that mean for the millions who saw themselves in her? What does it mean for the women she claimed to speak for? More importantly, can the brand survive without the illusion? The moment Jamie Kern Lima's podcast quote began circulating with viral speed, Meghan Markle's team reportedly went into high alert. The clip was only 23 seconds long, but in the world of digital perception, it might as well have been an hour-long exposé. And what made it so effective, so dangerous to Meghan's carefully constructed image, was that it didn't scream. It whispered. A whisper, however, can become a roar when the internet picks it up. Within hours, journalists, former royal commentators, and influencers from every corner of the digital world began stitching together timelines, reposting context, and reigniting old controversies. Memes, side-by-side video edits, and did she mean Meghan? Reaction videos dominated TikTok and Instagram. The podcast host, who had remained mostly neutral during the recording, was now being asked for clarification. She declined. Jamie, too, remained silent. But silence was not Meghan's strong suit, at least not when her image was involved. According to sources allegedly close to Meghan's inner circle, the reaction behind closed doors was anything but silent. She was blindsided. One individual with connections to her PR strategy team reportedly told a media outlet off the record. She saw it as a direct attack, even if her name wasn't mentioned. The timing, the wording, she believed it was intentional. In private, Meghan reportedly described the quote as cruel, condescending, and strategically designed to humiliate. Not because it was loud or overt, but because it was subtle. Because it left just enough room for ambiguity while delivering the maximum sting. It was, in Meghan's view, the very definition of a well-dressed dagger, one coated in faux sisterhood but meant to wound nonetheless. The most telling indicator of Meghan's internal reaction, however, was the flurry of activity that followed. Crisis management meetings were said to have been held within 48 hours of the clip going viral. Archewell's PR team allegedly explored options, ranging from a quiet outreach to Jamie requesting clarification to a carefully worded women supporting women post that could subtly frame Jamie's words as unnecessarily harsh. Ultimately, nothing was published. And this silence, unusual for Meghan, who typically controls her public image with almost obsessive precision, only fueled speculation. Was she too rattled to respond? Or was this the quiet before a calculated counterattack? Insiders claimed that Meghan initially wanted to call Jamie directly. She had, after all, admired her story from afar. There was even talk in 2021 of a potential collaboration between Archewell and Jamie's beauty brand on a women's empowerment initiative, though nothing materialized. Some believe that in Meghan's mind, Jamie was one of the few public figures she saw as a peer, self-made, driven, and grounded in story-first branding. The alleged betrayal, then, was not just reputational. It was personal. She feels like someone she respected turned on her, another source claimed. And worse, did it publicly, without even giving her the decency of a heads up. That's what cut the deepest. Reports from Montecito suggest that Meghan became reclusive for several days following the podcast explosion. Not devastated in the traditional sense. This wasn't grief, but deeply agitated, even humiliated. Her brand had survived harsh tabloid treatment, intense scrutiny from British media, and the icy glares of royal traditionalists. But this felt different. Jamie wasn't part of that world. She wasn't the enemy. She was supposed to be an ally. And when an ally turns, or appears to, it triggers something much deeper. What hurt more was the fact that Jamie's words resonated. Meghan's team monitored comments, social sentiment, and media mentions obsessively, and what they reportedly saw was a painful pattern. People agreeing. Not everyone, of course. Meghan still had her defenders. But even among those who once cheered her from the sidelines, there was a growing sense of discomfort. I always admired Meghan, but this hit hard. One former fan posted on Twitter. Jamie didn't say her name, but it made me reflect. Are we following Meghan because of what she's survived, or because of what she sells? For a woman who had positioned herself as the voice of female empowerment, self-acceptance, and healing from trauma, this shift in tone was more than PR trouble. It was brand erosion. And in Meghan's world, the brand is everything. Her allies in the entertainment world were reportedly split on how to advise her. Some encouraged a swift response, perhaps a candid interview or podcast episode where Meghan could speak openly about the burden of judgment and the loneliness of being misunderstood. Others warned against giving Jamie's comment more oxygen. Silence is strength. One Hollywood executive was rumored to have told her team, "Let it pass." But letting it pass didn't stop the bleeding. In the days that followed, Meghan's name was once again in the headlines, but not for her work, her causes, or her next project. The conversation wasn't about activism or Archwell or even the royal family. It was about performance, authenticity, and whether Meghan was more actress than advocate. And as Meghan quietly withdrew from public view, Jamie Kern Lima continued with business as usual. She gave another podcast interview, this time about leadership. She posted affirmations on social media. She made no reference to Meghan or the viral storm she had unintentionally or intentionally sparked. That was perhaps the most frustrating element of all for Meghan, Jamie's refusal to engage. No clarification, no retraction, no escalation, just silence. The message was clear. Jamie didn't need the drama. And that, in its own way, was a flex. It positioned her as someone above the fray, someone whose authenticity didn't require validation. And what of Harry during all this? Reports vary. Some suggest he was caught off guard by Meghan's reaction, that he felt Jamie's comment was vague enough to ignore. But others claim he was equally furious, perhaps not at Jamie, but at the impact it had on Meghan. He reportedly blamed the media for twisting the quote, insisting it was just another attempt to tear her down. Still, his public silence mirrored hers. No statements, no appearances, no Instagram posts, just the Montecito walls closing in a little tighter. What emerged in the days and weeks following the podcast firestorm was a sense that something had shifted permanently, not just for Meghan, but for her audience. The power of Jamie's words wasn't in the insult, it was in the implication that perhaps, beneath the polished speeches and curated pain, there existed a woman more invested in image than truth. And for someone whose entire public presence rests on being believed, that's a dangerous shadow to fall under. In the days following the viral explosion of her podcast clip, Jamie Kern Lima could have easily issued a clarification. She could have distanced herself from the speculation swirling around her carefully chosen words. She could have pivoted, softened the statement, or offered a diplomatic apology that would quiet the storm and preserve alliances. Instead, she chose silence. And then, when she did speak, it wasn't to explain. It was to reaffirm. Appearing on a follow-up podcast with a longtime collaborator and friend, Jamie was asked directly, though still carefully, about the recent wave of controversy. The host framed it gently, noting the powerful reactions to her quote about pretenders and crowns. They didn't name Meghan. They didn't need to. The subtext was heavy in the room. Jamie's response was measured but firm. "I've learned that telling the truth, even when it's uncomfortable, isn't something you owe an apology for," she said. her voice calm but purposeful. Sometimes, when you've walked through fire, you can spot smoke a mile away. And it's not about judgment. It's about discernment. There's a difference between women who live their message and those who market it. It was a subtle doubling down, polite, non-confrontational, but unmistakable. She wasn't retracting anything. She wasn't backing off. If anything, she was going deeper. Jamie's stance sparked a fresh wave of praise and criticism alike. Her followers celebrated her as a rare voice of candor in an industry steeped in flattery and facade. The comment sections under her posts became forums of affirmation. Women sharing their own experiences with inauthentic mentors, empowerment figures who turned out to be transactional, and influencers who monetized trauma instead of healing from it. Jamie's words had struck a chord not because they were cruel, but because they were painfully relatable. But with that support came the inevitable backlash. Accusations began to surface. Claims that Jamie was engaging in mean girl behavior, that she was being passive-aggressive, that calling out other women, even indirectly, was not in line with the very empowerment she preached. Her critics said her comments felt smug, holier-than-thou, and unhelpful, that instead of building up women, she was tearing them down. Jamie didn't flinch. In an Instagram Live a few days later, addressing the broader topic of authenticity and leadership, she once again made her position clear. There is a massive difference between supporting women and supporting dishonesty just because a woman is delivering it. We have to stop confusing unity with enabling. Empowerment doesn't mean blind loyalty. It means truth-telling, even when it's inconvenient. What made Jamie's position so unshakable was her track record. This wasn't a woman who had built a platform on criticizing others. She didn't engage in gossip. She didn't rely on drama to fuel engagement. Her brand was built on showing up exactly as she was, especially when it wasn't glamorous. Her rise came from moments of radical vulnerability, crying on live television, revealing the self-doubt behind her billion-dollar business, sharing about infertility, fear, rejection, and failure. Her words carried weight because they came from a place of lived experience, not projection. And this, perhaps, is what separated her most distinctly from Meghan in the public's eyes. Meghan's image, for all its polish, often felt protected, distant. Even her most emotional revelations were surrounded by cameras, makeup teams, and production crews. They were delivered through billion-dollar platforms and mega deals. Jamie, on the other hand, had become famous precisely because she was unfiltered, because she was real, not just in message, but in delivery. So when Jamie stood her ground, the public listened, not as a celebrity feud, but as a cultural referendum. Women everywhere began asking questions. What does empowerment really look like? Who gets to define authenticity? Is image-driven vulnerability still vulnerability at all? And, perhaps most strikingly, are we too quick to confuse charisma with character? For Jamie, the fallout wasn't a setback. Her book sales reportedly surged. Engagement across her social channels spiked. She received invitations to speak at new women's leadership conferences and summits. Major outlets covered her comments as part of a broader conversation about public-facing feminism and the commodification of identity. And in each instance, Jamie refused to play the villain or the victim. She remained resolutely grounded, unshaken by either applause or critique. Her refusal to engage in a direct back-and-forth with Meghan, despite the opportunity to capitalize on global attention, further cemented her credibility. She didn't need to name names. She didn't need to win. She simply allowed the audience to decide for themselves. And that was perhaps the boldest move of all. Because in a media landscape where everyone seems to have an agenda, where outrage is currency and clickbait is king, Jamie Kern Lima chose clarity over chaos. She wasn't interested in feuds. She was interested in standards. And whether intentionally or not, she set one. Her message was simple: truth needs no apology. And while Meghan Markle continued to stay silent, choosing, perhaps strategically, to let the moment fade, Jamie's words remained etched in the public mind. Because they weren't about Meghan specifically. They were about all of us. About the lies we believe, the performances we applaud, and the real women we often ignore in favor of those who fit a more marketable mold. For Meghan, this refusal to bend, to soften, to extend a public olive branch must have been infuriating. A clapback she couldn't control, a narrative she couldn't rewrite, a confrontation she couldn't spin into another documentary or sit-down interview. And for the first time in a long while, the spotlight was not hers alone. It wasn't the first time Meghan Markle had been accused of hypocrisy, but Jamie Kern Lima's veiled comments gave that lingering criticism a renewed momentum. What had once been whispered in corners of Reddit threads and conservative commentary circles was now back in the mainstream, this time echoed by a woman who, unlike typical detractors, had built her platform not on royal gossip, but on female empowerment. The accusation was simple and brutal. Meghan Markle, for all her speeches and statements about women's rights, was not an authentic feminist. She was a brand. And once the performance began to fracture, the public started to re-examine everything. The term fake feminist had trailed Meghan like a shadow long before the podcast firestorm. To her defenders, the phrase was nothing more than a sexist, racially loaded attack used by critics who couldn't stomach a woman of color speaking out. But to her detractors, and even to some former supporters, the phrase had teeth, especially when applied to the discrepancy between Meghan's public messaging and private behavior. Because while Meghan often positioned herself as a champion of women, her track record, they argued, didn't always support that claim. The most glaring point of controversy had come from inside the royal household. Reports dating back to 2018 and 2019, which had once been dismissed as tabloid noise, resurfaced now with fresh scrutiny. Multiple palace staffers, most of them women, had allegedly quit or been reassigned due to Meghan's management style. While some claim burnout due to the sheer workload of serving a high-profile couple navigating new roles, others described an environment laced with emotional manipulation, belittling, and even bullying. The so-called bullying dossier, which was said to contain formal HR complaints, never saw full public release. But snippets were leaked. Some aides claimed they were reduced to tears. Others reported abrupt firings. A senior staffer anonymously stated that Meghan expected impossible perfection, and if that wasn't delivered, punishment was swift and cold. One former aide told a journalist, "She was great at speaking about lifting women up, but when you were behind closed doors with her, you felt constantly on edge, like you were disposable." At the time, Meghan's team denied the allegations in full. A spokesperson dismissed the reports as a smear campaign launched by the palace just ahead of her explosive Oprah interview. Archewell's PR arm even issued a statement suggesting that Meghan was saddened by the attacks on her character, particularly from a system she had tried to modernize with compassion and leadership. The implication was clear. These weren't legitimate criticisms. They were institutional pushback from a palace resistant to change. But now, in the context of Jamie Kern Lima's viral moment, those same criticisms resurfaced under a different light, not as palace gossip, but as evidence. Women began asking uncomfortable questions. Can someone who allegedly mistreats other women still call herself a feminist? Does a platform built on empowerment still hold weight if the foundation behind the scenes is cracked? In a world hypersensitive to performative activism, Meghan's situation began to resemble that of other public figures who had been brought down, not by scandal, but by contradiction. Think Ellen DeGeneres, whose "Be Kind" mantra was ultimately undermined by allegations of a toxic work environment. Or influencers who champion body positivity online, but promote unrealistic beauty standards in their branding deals. Authenticity, once breached, is difficult to restore. And that breach was now open. Meghan's appearances, once met with applause, began receiving mixed responses. At a recent charity event, attendees noted a chill in the atmosphere. One participant, speaking to a journalist off the record, remarked, "She looks polished. But something's missing. It's like she's still playing the part, but the audience isn't buying it anymore." Others pointed out that Meghan's interactions with volunteers and staff seemed robotic, distant, as though she were going through the motions of compassion without actually engaging emotionally. Then came the re-examination of her speeches. Quotes that once sounded empowering now struck some as hollow. Her 2020 virtual speech to a women's leadership summit, where she urged women to use your voice, even when it shakes, was clipped and reposted alongside Jamie Kern Lima's now iconic line about women who wear crowns, not to serve, but to shield. The comparison was unavoidable. One message felt lived, the other scripted. feminist authors and thought leaders began entering the conversation. Some defended Meghan, pointing out that all women, especially those in high-profile, male-dominated institutions, are judged more harshly. Others weren't so forgiving. A prominent feminist blogger wrote, "Feminism isn't a marketing strategy. It's a lived experience, one that must be backed by consistent action. You don't get to build a throne on the language of sisterhood and then mistreat the women who hold it up." Even in academia, the debate took hold. A sociology professor specializing in gender studies commented in a panel discussion, "The Meghan Markle moment is a case study in modern identity politics. She represents both the power of narrative and the peril of misalignment. When a public figure speaks the language of social justice but fails to embody its principles privately, disillusionment is inevitable." And disillusionment was exactly what Meghan was facing. It wasn't just that Jamie had questioned her. It was that she had inadvertently reminded the public of old wounds. And wounds, once reopened, tend to bleed. Even her most recent interviews, where she spoke about motherhood, legacy, and her hopes for the future, were picked apart with greater scrutiny. Was she speaking from the heart, or rehearsing a message her team had fine-tuned for mass appeal? Perhaps the most painful consequence of this renewed accusation was the shifting sentiment among her core demographic, millennial and Gen Z women. These were the same groups that had lifted Meghan to icon status after the Oprah interview. The same followers who had defended her against relentless British tabloid coverage. The same young feminists who had reposted her speeches, quoted her on social media, and celebrated her departure from the palace as an act of feminist defiance. Now, many of them were reevaluating that loyalty. On TikTok, a viral video titled, "Why I No Longer Support Meghan Markle" garnered over 1.2 million views in less than a week. The young woman in the video detailed her shift in perspective, not out of spite, but out of disappointment. "I wanted her to be real," she said, "but it feels like she's selling a version of herself, not showing us the truth." Other creators followed suit, posting breakdowns of past interviews, speeches, and controversies. The tone wasn't malicious, it was weary. A collective sigh from a generation tired of being sold empowerment by people who treat it like a brand asset rather than a belief. And through it all, Meghan remained silent. Whether her silence was strategic or reflective is anyone's guess. But one thing became increasingly clear: the narrative was no longer hers to control. When Meghan Markle launched her much-anticipated Spotify podcast, Archetypes, in August 2022, the build-up had been massive. It was heralded as a groundbreaking new chapter in the Sussex's content empire, a platform through which Meghan could authentically explore and dismantle the stereotypes that hold women back. With the name derived from their son Archie and the broader concept of societal roles and labels, Archetypes was positioned not just as a podcast, but as a movement. The message was clear. Meghan was ready to go deep, to take listeners on an intimate journey into the complexities of womanhood, identity, race, power, and voice. But the question that increasingly loomed after Jamie Kern Lima's now famous quote was Archetypes ever about truth, or just another curated extension of the Meghan Markle brand? In the months following the podcast's debut, the content initially seemed to deliver on its promise. Meghan interviewed a high-profile lineup of female guests: Serena Williams, Mariah Carey, Paris Hilton, Mindy Kaling, and others. Each episode focusing on a particular label or stereotype that women face: diva, ambitious, angry, bimbo. These topics had cultural weight, and the series was praised in some circles for opening up space for women to confront how language and society shape their self-perception. But behind the scenes, the cracks were already forming. Insiders at Spotify reportedly described production difficulties, creative disagreements, and a growing sense that the podcast wasn't delivering the authenticity it had promised. Listeners, too, began to notice. For all the flashy names and elegant production, many episodes felt overly rehearsed, less like a conversation, more like a series of mini-monologues wrapped in soft music and soothing narration. Meghan, critics claimed, rarely allowed the guests to fully open up without redirecting the conversation back to herself. It wasn't that her voice lacked value, but it lacked vulnerability. Her stories often felt curated, precisely engineered to create the illusion of relatability without exposing any real emotional risk. The most telling moment came in episode 2, when Meghan interviewed Mariah Carey. What was expected to be a powerful exploration of biracial identity took an awkward turn when Carey playfully called Meghan a diva. Meghan appeared visibly uncomfortable, and in her post-interview reflection, she confessed she had been rattled by the comment. She then reasserted her usual narrative, one of being misunderstood, wrongly labeled, and burdened by expectations. Rather than diving into Carey's intent or the cultural nuances of reclaiming the word, Meghan brought the focus back to her own discomfort. For some listeners, this pattern became increasingly frustrating. Instead of giving guests the space to speak from their own experiences, Meghan often interrupted with her own stories, carefully wrapped in self-aware reflection. It was like she was auditioning for the listener's approval, one review noted. Every anecdote was strategically placed, every emotional beat rehearsed. Spotify executives reportedly began having concerns about audience retention. While the podcast debuted high on the charts, thanks in part to Meghan's name and the marketing muscle behind it, listener drop-off was significant. Analytics allegedly showed that while people tuned in, fewer stayed through full episodes. The criticism echoed a recurring theme. It felt more like a product than a podcast, more branding than bonding. Behind closed doors, reports circulated of mounting tension between Meghan's production team and Spotify. There were delays in delivering promised content. Creative direction became a point of contention. Spotify executives had expected raw, honest, memorable conversations. Instead, they got episodes that felt like scripted image control exercises. The storytelling lacked edge. The vulnerability felt filtered. Even guests who had powerful, harrowing stories to share seemed underutilized, tied to a format that prioritized Meghan's image over their truth. By the time Spotify canceled the multi-million-dollar deal in June 2023, the writing had long been on the wall. Publicly, both parties issued vague statements about going in different creative directions, but sources close to the situation claimed otherwise. They didn't get what they paid for, one industry insider said. Spotify thought they were signing on to Oprah 2.0. What they got was a podcast about Meghan, by Meghan, for Meghan. The fallout was swift and painful. Critics immediately branded the project a failure. Phrases like vanity project and content without soul became commonplace in commentary threads and op-eds. Even fans were left disappointed, feeling that an opportunity had been squandered. Archetypes, which could have been a platform to uplift unheard voices, instead became another channel for a woman who seemed increasingly out of touch with the audience she claimed to represent. But the damage wasn't just reputational, it was philosophical. Archetypes had promised to dismantle the very stereotypes Meghan herself was accused of reinforcing: being self-obsessed, emotionally manipulative, image-obsessed, and inaccessible. Instead of breaking down the walls, Meghan appeared to build new ones, wrapped in beautiful production and eloquent phrasing, but devoid of true emotional transparency. The podcast never felt like a safe space for raw female stories. It felt like an audition tape. And Jamie Kern Lima's comments had, perhaps unknowingly, pulled the curtain back on all of it. Because Jamie's podcast moment didn't just question Meghan's authenticity in vague philosophical terms, it punctured the heart of what Archetypes was supposed to be. Jamie spoke of women who confuse performance with purpose, who wear masks while preaching about removing them. And suddenly, the entire Archetypes series seemed like evidence in support of that claim. Even more telling was the way Meghan chose to frame herself in the podcast's promotional material. Rather than emphasizing the guests, the narratives, or the topics, most of the visuals and social posts focused on Meghan herself, her voice, her reflections, her journey. While other hosts disappear behind their guests, Meghan remained the central figure in every episode. The irony was painful. A show about dismantling labels became a masterclass in label preservation. Meghan wasn't challenging the archetypes, she was reinforcing her own. As media analysts continued dissecting the Spotify fallout, many agreed on one central point. Meghan Markle, for all her charisma and poise, still hadn't figured out how to let go of control. And without vulnerability, true connection was impossible. In the aftermath, Archetypes quietly disappeared from public conversation. There was no second season, no follow-up project, no viral moment of redemption. Just a long, awkward silence and a lingering sense that Meghan had once again squandered an opportunity, not for fame, but for real impact. Because if archetypes had been truly authentic, if it had prioritized guest stories over curated branding, it could have been transformative. It could have become a home for women to unpack the cultural baggage they carry every day. But instead, it became another stage, another spotlight, another layer in the Meghan Markle performance. And when Jamie Kern Lima spoke of masks and crowns, of women who confuse empowerment with ego, the audience didn't need to wonder who she was referring to. They already knew.